We've already seen that phrase used once before in this book, the generations of. This is the account, actually is how it is stated in Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth. Now this is the book of the generations. This phrase that Moses uses is a very key phrase to be able to divide the book. In other words, this is a marker. You put this marker down. That's the indicator that you're to put a marker down in the story that he's telling. And so he's telling us about Adam's generations, Adam's descendants. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Here he emphasizes God's authority. God is sovereign. God is supreme over all. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. Notice, he names them, Adam and Eve, man. The New American Standard Version has that word man capitalized. And I think that's for good reason, because he's calling them literally Adam or man. That is their family name. Verse 3 tells us, when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. Notice, he's 130 years old when he has Seth. I saw a news story yesterday that said the oldest living person in the world is 116 years old in Japan. And the oldest living man the year before was 116 years old in Japan. And now we see here Adam is 130 years old and has his third son, Seth. And it's interesting that Moses, beginning here in verse 3, gives us a pattern of a structure, that is, and how he's going to tell this. He gives the age before he produced the child, the birth of the child, the years of patriarchy after the child's birth, the fact of additional children, the total years of the patriarch, and the fact of his death. That structure will carry through all the way through the story of the patriarchs, that basic structure of telling his descendants. Verse 4 then says, then the days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. 930 years old. That's a long, long life, isn't it? But notice what he says. And he died. Eventually there comes that moment when you have to go the way of all the world. That is, you die. And that's what Adam did. Notice also in verse 4, he had other sons and daughters. That's the reason why we know where Cain got his wife was one of his sisters. Had to have been. God did not create from the dust of the ground or from the rib of man's side other men and women. It was other sons and daughters where they got their wives and husbands. And that's going to factor in just a little bit when we get further into this story. Seth lived 105 years and became the father of Enosh. Then Seth lived 807 years after he became the father of Enosh, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. So Adam lives 930, Seth lives 912. Enosh lived 90 years and became the father of Kenan. Then Enosh lived 815 years after he became the father of Kenan, and he had other sons and daughters, so all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. There's a pattern here, as you can tell. Kenan lived 70 years and became the father of Mahalalel. Then Kenan lived 840 years after he became the father of Mahalalel, and he had other sons and daughters, so all the days of Kenan were 910 years. And he died. Now, again, let's stress that one of the reasons why of you have a long lifespan is because at this point there had been no rain on the earth. And remember what Moses had said all the way back in chapter 1, that there was water below the expanse and water above the expanse. In essence, you have a canopy, a ring of water around the earth, surrounding the earth, filtering out the ultraviolet rays of the sun. That would reduce the aging effects of the sun upon human beings. Plus, you have the perfect genetic pair, Adam and Eve, and there's not going to be that much difference between the first genetic pair and this. So there's going to be that really good genetics going on still. Not a lot of corruption has entered in yet. Not a lot of disease has entered in yet. So you got long lifespans so far. Remember, mankind was intended to, well, I say intended, mankind was built originally to live forever physically, as God had created it. But then sin entered in, and we saw what happened with that. So, Mahalalel lived 65 years and became the father of Jared. Then Mahalalel lived 830 years after he became the father of Jared, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years. And he died. Didn't quite get to the magic 900, you see. But Jared lived 162 years and became the father of Enoch. Then Jared lived 800 years after he became the father of Enoch, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years. And he died. So he lives 962. Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah. And he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Very unusual description that Moses gives of Enoch. And the only other time, well, one of the other times that we read about Enoch is in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, in that great faith chapter of the Bible. We read in Hebrews 11:5, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. And he was not found because God took him up. For he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. That's all we know about Enoch, what Moses writes, and then what the Hebrews writer states about him. He walked with God. He pleased God. I'd like to know a lot more about this man. I would love to know a lot more about Enoch. Why he is singled out by Moses and by the Hebrews writer. By faith, Enoch was not. That is, Enoch was translated. Elijah, we know Elijah the prophet was also translated that he should not see death. Two human beings that did not see death as we see it. They were translated, whatever that is involved with that. It could possibly be the similar thing that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians where he talks about the state of affairs at the resurrection. We who are alive and remain shall be called up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. At the day of judgment, if we are present when the Lord comes, if we are alive, we are going to be taken up into the air. And yet we know that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So we somehow will be changed, translated. We will not see death. To me, at least, it seems like a similar situation has happened here with Enoch and with Elijah. They did not die as we die, and as all the other human beings that have lived or ever will live have died. But yet, he was translated. He walked with God. God took him. Very, very unusual statement, but what a statement to make. This man was singled out because of his faith. Methuselah lived 187 years and became the father of Lamech. Then Methuselah lived 782 years after he became the father of Lamech, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. Have you ever heard the phrase, he's as old as Methuselah? Well, of course they're not as old as Methuselah. Nobody is as old as Methuselah, 969 years. When I saw that story that I mentioned to you about the lady that is 116 years old, you know, Brenda and I were watching the news, and I turned to Brenda and said that she's not as old as Methuselah. Well, that's true. You're 116 years old, doesn't even touch the hem of the garment to this man. But notice the statement, and he died. Now, if you do the math on this, Methuselah died the same year the flood came. Now, the question being, did Methuselah die before the flood came? Or did Methuselah die in the flood? That's an interesting question. We really won't know the answer to that. Nothing is said about Methuselah like is said about Enoch, his father. That doesn't necessarily mean anything because nothing is said about the rest of these descendants of Seth. Yet Methuselah died in the year the flood came. This always struck me as a very interesting fact. And the question that arises from it is something that we can ponder and won't know the answer to until after the day of judgment. Lamech lived 182 years and became the father of a son. Now he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands, arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed." The name Noah means bring relief. So it's a play on words. Lamech is saying, this son is going to bring relief, is going to bring us or give us rest. He has high hopes for Noah. He has high hopes for him that he would be able to till the ground and be able to get many things out of the ground, unlike his descendants before him. Then Lamech lived 595 years after he became the father of Noah, and he had other sons and daughters, so all the days of Lamech were 777 years. And he died. Again, was Lamech one of those who was killed in the flood? Or did he die before the flood came? We're simply not told that. We just know that his lifespan is much shorter than the others that came before him, about 200 or so years shorter. Noah was 500 years old, and Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So at 500, Noah has 3 sons. Could these sons have been triplets? We're not told. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Some have speculated in years gone by that these 3 boys could possibly be the forerunners of the major races of the world. I don't know if I agree with that. I really don't see the connection there. All we do know is that Shem, Ham, and Japheth are going to be significant immediately following the flood, and in fact during the years leading up to the flood. Any questions or comments about anything we've said thus far before we get into chapter 6? All right. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Now, the sons of God and the daughters of men. Much speculation has centered around that phrase, sons of God. Specifically, there have been those who have said that the sons of God would refer to angels who came to earth and somehow procreated with women because of later what we're going to be reading about the Nephilim, as we'll see in just a few verses. Much speculation has been offered as far as that's concerned. I don't buy that. I don't buy it for a moment. Because what the Lord himself said about angels or those angelic beings is that they neither marry, or talking about the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of heaven. He's there clearly stating that angelic beings do not reproduce. At the very least, they do not marry. Now, angels, as we see throughout the Old Testament, do occasionally take on human form, no doubt. But as far as having any kind of relations with human beings in the sense of a husband and wife relationship, we're never told that. So to assume that these sons of men, or sons of God that is, are angels, is to really stretch way beyond what the text states. But who are they? Who are the sons of God? I think the answer is fairly clear when you look at, back up in verse 4 of chapter 5. Seth, or actually verse 7, I'm sorry, verse 7. Seth lived 807 years after he became the father of Enosh, and he had other sons and daughters. To me, at least, it seems that the sons of God were the descendants of Seth. We also know that Cain had already settled. He took him a wife, and he had sons and daughters. So it would seem to me, at least, as it has to others, that the sons of God refers to the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men would refer to the descendants of Cain. Now, some would have a problem with that. Well, that's fine. Seems to me, though, as more in line with the text, with the context, what Moses is saying, than to speculate about angels coming down and doing all that. That just strikes me as fanciful. Yes, sir. Yes. In a general sense, you've got the followers of God and those that weren't following God. And let me also indicate, too, I'll add to this, that not all the descendants of Seth were sons of God. I think you can pick up on these descendants that Moses lists in chapter 5, that there were some who did not follow after God. Because he singles out Enoch, for one thing, that Enoch walked with God and was not because God took him. Enoch was a special case in God's sight. However, in a general sense, I believe that would really hold up, that the sons of God would be descendants of Seth, and the sons and daughters of men would be the descendants of Cain. However, the fact is that they were procreating here in verse 2. Verse 3, then, the Lord said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Now that does not indicate that his lifespan from this point on is going to be 120 years. I used to think that until I really looked at the context carefully. It seems to me at least that this 120 years, his days shall be 120 years, is indicative of the time that's left until the judgment of God comes. That's how much time is left for man, because of the fact that they were beginning to turn away from God. Look at verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The King James says they were giants, and that's quite a possibility, but we know that the text itself says that they were mighty men. Physically, they were stronger than usual. They were men of renown. In fact, you look over in Numbers 13:33, and Caleb is giving the report that he and Joshua had of spying out the land. And he says, there also we saw the Nephilim. Moses adds, the sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Actually, that is the the report of the evil spies, not of Caleb and Joshua. He's talking about the Nephilim, the descendants of the Nephilim were there in the land. And we're just like grasshoppers. We're just like midgets. And so Moses is referring back to these individuals that we have referenced in chapter 6. These were simply men of physical stature and of strength that was far above the norm. And that's what gives rise, by the way, to the speculation that this was something far, far more unusual. That this somehow was a supernatural thing. But it's really not when you look at the context of it. Verse 5 then says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." What a testimony to that generation. Every thought of his heart, every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. We bemoan and we complain about how evil our society has gotten, and to a certain extent that is indeed the case. It's worse than I've seen it, more open than I've seen it in my lifetime. Yet we're not to this point, by far. We're not to the point that these people had gotten prior to the flood. Every intent of the thoughts of his heart was evil continually, and it got to the point, verse 6 tells us, the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth. And he was grieved in his heart. Now we know that God does not have a heart. This is an anthropomorphism, attributing to God human qualities, trying to get us to be able to identify with God. In other words, God was grieved. God was distressed. Sin always upsets God, and right here we see an example of it. He was sorry. The King James says that the Lord repented. Not a good phrase to use in our day and time. The King James translators knew what they were saying. The people in the 18th, 17th centuries knew what they were saying, but that's not a really good way to translate that. The Lord was sorry. He changed his mind. The Lord does not sin as we do, and has no need of repenting of sin as we do. The Lord simply changed his mind. The Lord changed his mind on many occasions in the Bible. And here is one of them. He was grieved in his heart. Verse 7, the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. God decides, we're going to wipe it out. We're going to wipe the slate clean. We're going to get rid of all of it. And we're going to start again. Think about that, folks. When God gets to that point that he is ready just to do away with it and get it going once more, that's wickedness. How many people are on the face of the earth at this point? We simply don't know. We can only speculate on that. All we do know is what Peter says. The world that then was, that is prior to the flood, perished. But the world that is now is reserved unto judgment. Peter makes a distinction between the world that was and the world that is. And in a physical sense, as far as the earth is concerned, you can see evidences of that still. You can see evidences of a great catastrophe that changed the earth. And you can see what Peter's talking about as far as the geologic sense, the world that then was perished. The world that is now. You know, in mythology you have the story of Atlantis, the lost colony, the lost continent of Atlantis. Could that be, in a mythological sense, referring to some sort of continent that indeed was destroyed by God in the flood? It's a possibility. Remember, Moses seems to indicate in chapter 1 that all of the landmass was together in one landmass. And you can see evidence of that still between the eastern coast of South America and the western coast of Africa. It seems like they could fit together perfectly. Madagascar could fit on the eastern side of Africa perfectly. And other places you can see where some of those things would fit together. But could there have been a lost continent? I think it's possible. Because the world that then was perished. But we have the world that is now that's reserved to judgment. And so, the Lord decides He's going to get rid of all of it. But verse 8, Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Here's where I love the King James translation. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. That's the idea. That word can be translated grace and favor. I like grace right there. Noah found grace. The first time this word is used in the Bible is in connection with Noah. Noah didn't deserve this favor. He didn't earn this grace. He found it. He found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Why did he find favor? Why did he find grace in the eyes of the Lord? Well, Moses answers that question in the next verse. These are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God. There you have it. Noah was righteous. Noah was blameless. Noah walked with God. Does that mean that Noah was sinless? Absolutely not. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Paul tells us that in Romans 3. What does it mean? That means that Noah stood out from all the rest of his generation in that he had determined, he had decided that he would walk with God. He would not be like those of the rest of his age. He would be the Lord's. That's the decision that you and I have got to make in our own day. Under the covenant that we live, the new covenant. We've got to make that decision. Am I going to walk with God? Am I going to try my best to be righteous? I can't be righteous in the sense that I know no sin apart from the gospel. But am I going to walk with God and try to be just and upright and blameless in my dealings? Or am I going to just go along with the crowd and go along with the rest of the world? That's the decision Noah had to make. And that's the decision we've got to make.
It's interesting to note that Enoch and Noah are the only ones back there, not whom it is said they walked with God. So they were other good men.
Right.
But it's only said those two men.
Those are singled out. Enoch singled out. Noah singled out. They were special in the sense that they stood out. They stood out from the rest. Yes, exactly. There were others who, I'm sure, among the descendants of Seth, because it says the sons of God, there were those who were striving to walk after God. But Enoch stood out and then Noah stood out. They had a special relationship with God. Moses doesn't go into great detail as to describing how that happened or why this is the case. He just states it. And Noah found grace. So here in Genesis 6, we have the earliest mention of the concept of grace in the entire Bible. And watch further. Verse 10, Noah became the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This is not in the order of their birth necessarily. They could be triplets, or they could have been born separately. We simply don't know who's the oldest, who's the middle, who's the youngest. They're just simply born to Noah. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. That's a parallelism, by the way. We talk about Hebrew parallelism. This is one of the earliest examples of it. The earth was corrupt, the earth was filled. Verse 12, God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. The flesh, that is mankind, was corrupt. It was filled with violence. We look at our society today and we see a society that's worse off than it's been in a long time. Violence, sin, corruption, crime, and the like. And yet it's nothing to what Noah had to deal with. It's nothing to what Noah and his 3 sons had to face in their day. And it got to the point that God had decided to end all of it. God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. And behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth." He says, I'm just going to get rid of all of it. In some way, and we're not really told how, in some way the sins of man had actually corrupted the earth itself. That's an interesting thing to contemplate. How did this generation of mankind actually affect the world? And no, I'm not talking about the environmentalist wacko mindset. I'm not talking about that. The sins of man somehow had corrupted the earth to where God decided not only to wipe out humankind, He's going to reform the earth itself. How advanced technologically had mankind gotten up to this point? That's a question to ask. Moses doesn't answer that. He doesn't address that at all. He doesn't say how advanced mankind had become technologically. He doesn't tell us how advanced mankind had become when the earth was destroyed. That's an interesting thing to ponder. Because mankind technologically has come a long way in just 50 years. Think about now and 50 years ago. Think about the differences in technology. 50 years ago, would you have ever thought that you could pull out a phone like this and contact somebody around the world? Or at least on this phone that you could actually FaceTime someone. You can look at their face and they can look at your face and communicate. That's science fiction stuff. That's Dick Tracy stuff. Oh, by the way, you do have watches that you can do the same thing like Dick Tracy did. Technologically, we've come a long way in just 50 years. Now look back 100 years. How far have we come in 100 years? Oh, boy. Yes. Now think 150, 200 years. How far have we come technologically? What are we talking here? We're talking a space of about 1,000 years between the time of Seth, maybe a little more than 1,000 years actually more than 1,000 years, between the time of Seth and the time of the flood. Do you think there's enough time for mankind to have developed technologically? Yeah. I think so. How far? Don't know. Moses doesn't say. All we are told is that God says, I'm going to destroy the earth as well as humankind. That's just something to ponder when you've got a spare moment. You can't really come to a definitive conclusion on that. I'm just putting it out there for you to contemplate. However, he does address Noah. And he says, make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with rooms, and shall cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you shall make it. The earth of the ark, the length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and finish it to a cubit from the top, and set the door of the ark in the side of it. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. Verse 8, we saw that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. There's your grace. Here in verses 13 through 15, or actually 13 through 16, God gives Moses instructions to follow. That is, he gives Moses a law to follow. God gives Moses a command. Make yourself an ark. What if Noah had refused? What would have happened? He and his family would have perished in the flood because no one else had found grace in his sight. So this is a direct command of God to Noah, who had been walking with God up to this point. If Noah had refused, he would have been disobedient to God. He had to do this to be right in the sight of God. Then he says, make an ark of gopher wood. And you ask, what is gopher wood? I can answer you that question in 3 words. I don't know. All I do know is God said, make an ark of gopher wood, and whatever that wood was, any other kind of wood would not have done in God's sight. Whatever gopher wood was, that's the kind of wood that Noah was to use. Some have suggested that that term gopher wood is a very broad term, covering many different kinds of wood. It's possible. But the principle still stands. If he had used any other kind of wood than gopher wood, that boat would not have been able to float. Make an ark of gopher wood. Then he says, make the ark with rooms. How many rooms could Noah put in the ark? God didn't say. It was more than one. What if Noah had said, I'm just going to make one big room in this ark? Nope. Make rooms, plural, in the ark. And it's left to Noah's judgment how many rooms to put. And then he says, cover it inside and out with pitch. So Noah's commanded to use pitch to cover it inside and outside. Could Noah heat that pitch? Yes. God didn't say not to. God simply said cover inside and out with pitch, but it's left to Noah's judgment if he is to heat the pitch or not heat the pitch. Then he says the length 300 cubits, breadth 50 cubits, height 30 cubits. I wish I had brought my cubit ruler with me. I have a cubit ruler, by the way, that can fold out. It's metal. Gospel Advocate put it out back in the 1960s. I've got one. You roll that thing out, and it's 18 inches exactly from top to bottom. If I put it at the tip of my elbow and extended it, it would extend all the way to the tip of my middle finger. That is a cubit. The average length of the forearm of a male, 18 inches. Now, the folks that did the Ark experience up in Kentucky, I think, took liberties with that. Because you do have the cubit as described, and then you have the royal cubit described in the New Testament. They try to put another measuring cubit, and I don't know what to think about that. I've got that rod that they sold at the Ark experience, and it's a different measurement than a regular cubit, and it's a different measurement than a royal cubit. I go by what Moses writes, a cubit, which is 18 inches. So if you use those dimensions, it is 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. That's a big boat. Now, if you go to the Ark experience in Kentucky, it's a very impressive structure. What they've done is impressive. And it gives you an idea of the immense size of that ark. No question about it. But I don't think that was anything like the reality. The real thing must have been a sight to behold when it was finished. And that ark was not designed to sail across the 7 seas. No. That ark was designed for one purpose and one purpose only, and it was to float. Float on top of the water. It was designed to withstand any and all storms, any and all winds, any and all floods that would come. It wasn't going to sink if Noah built it the way that God had designed it, and Noah did. Notice further, you shall make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit from the top. When I was growing up, when I was a little boy in the church, I remember pictures of the ark, and they show the window, and it's a little porthole, seems like, right there toward the top. No, that's not what Moses describes here, according to the text. It is an opening. It's a cubit opening. That is an 18-inch opening near the top. That makes sense. Because if you've got a lot of animals in a boat, you've got to have ventilation, don't you? You've got to have air circulating inside, not just for the animals, but also for the human beings inside it. Plus, when the rain stops, which it would, and the sun begins to come out, you've got to have some sort of indication for those animals of daytime and nighttime. God could put them in a state of hibernation for a while, but after the rain ceases and they would wake up, then they would have to have an indication of when to go to sleep, when to wake up. That makes a lot of sense, having an opening, a cubit above. And it's nothing like the miniseries that came on NBC years ago about Noah. Well, John Voight played Noah. That gives you one indication. But also, they had Noah's wife riding a horse on top of the ark after the rain stopped. Where do they get this? It's not from the text. When that movie came out with Russell Crowe, I thought, finally, they're going to depict the ark and the flood in a great way on the big screen. And then they came in with the giant rock people that helped Noah build the ark. Really? Are you going to stick with the text or not? Well, the text itself is amazing when you read this. Notice, set the door of the ark in the side of it. He's to build one door on that ark, one. He couldn't do more than one. How big would that door be? Doesn't say. It's left to Noah's judgment. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. 3 stories. 3 decks in that ark. Could Noah have put 4? No. Could he have put just 2? No. 3. 3 decks. So what we're saying is, Noah was given a law to follow. He was given instructions to follow. But there were certain things that were left to Noah's judgment. Question, could Noah have used tools to build this ark? Answer, yes. Noah said to build the ark. He didn't say anything about tools. Would he still have been building the ark using tools? Absolutely. Could Noah have hired out help to help him build? Yes. If he had chosen. When his sons got old enough, I am certain that his sons and their wives helped him build the ark. But there were things that were left in Noah's judgment. We're talking about generic and specific authority. That principle still holds true today. There's generic authority and there's specific authority. And we've got to acknowledge that. This is where we're going to stop for our study this morning. But I also want you to think about this. During the whole time that Noah is going to be building this ark, he's going to be doing something else according to Peter. Preach. Peter says that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. You think about it. He's building the ark and he takes some time off to preach to this wicked world. What a sight that must have been. Well, this is where we're going to stop. We're going to continue our study next week at verse 17.